To understand Ansel Adams
Speak up, Susie.
and his motivations in early life, it's important to discuss the family into which he was born. His father, Charles Hitchcock Adams, had been raised to be a gentleman. He was born to wealth. His family owned the prosperous Washington Lumber Mill Company, headquartered in San Francisco. And as a young adult in the late 1880s, he could look forward to a comfortable financial future. His plan was to live his life centered in nature, to live the Emersonian ideal. For those of us who haven't read Ralph Waldo Emerson recently, I just thought I'd put it up there as a reminder. However, the family company began to have serious difficulties, which forced him to drop out of the University of California, Berkeley after 2 years to assist at the mill. While the family business struggled, Charles, called Carly, fell in love with Olive Bray from Carson City, Nevada, and they married in 1896. During Olive's pregnancy in 1902, he began construction on a family home in an idyllic setting, as he had always longed for. He chose a site in the sand dunes on the western edge of San Francisco, with a panoramic view framed by Land's End to the west and the entrance to San Francisco Bay to the east. With this natural, rural setting, he believed it would be the perfect place to raise their son, Ansel, born on February 20th. The young Ansel was nurtured by Lobos Creek, which ran next to the house, and by Baker Beach at the bottom of the hill. From his bedroom window, he could see past Point Bonita and well into the sea. This is Baker Beach here on the right, and of course the bridge wasn't built at that point in time. And here's a photograph that Ansel took looking in that direction before the bridge was built, 1932. The historic San Francisco earthquake of 1906 damaged the house, causing young Ansel to break his nose, which was never fixed and made him somewhat odd looking as an adult. San Francisco was a growing city, and soon their isolated house became part of a neighborhood with pavements and a street address. Disaster continued to plague the Adams family. The following year, 1907, Ansel's grandfather, owner of the mill, died. The mill failed and was plagued by fire, including most of the mill's transport ships. With the family wealth gone, the once optimistic Carly, Ansel's father, in an effort to uphold the family's honor, spent most of his life working to repay the business debts. To complicate matters further, his wife Olive's father and her sister Mary, both without means, came to live with them permanently. Ansel adored his father. Carly instilled in his son his Emersonian values, his philosophy of humanism, and a conviction that beliefs should be expressed through actions. He taught Ansel responsibility to society and the importance of transmitting knowledge to the next generation. He accepted as norms both individualism and nonconformity. Carly was not religious in the institutional sense. They did not attend church. He believed that religion was found in nature and therein best practiced in a more direct relationship with God. As for Ansel's education, he was an enormously curious and gifted child. He was also hyperactive. He did not fit well into the regimentation of school. His inability to adapt to its rigid structures led to his enrollment in a succession of schools in an attempt to find an appropriate match of student to institution. After several years of unsuccessful attempts, his father decided to have him privately tutored, which led to much better results. Understanding his son's need for a flexible structure, Carly proposed an educational setting in 1915 when Ansel was 13 that would be extremely innovative even today. The Panama Pacific International Exposition, celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal, was being held for a year in San Francisco. So every day, he dropped his son off on his way to work to explore the exhibits alone. And whenever possible, he left the office early so that they could then explore the displays together. I was actually fascinated by this. The size and scope of it was really magnificent. Ansel studied each exhibit, and it's possible that those of photography and painting influenced his future as a visual artist. The displays included 3 photographs by the young photographer Edward Weston and paintings by Cézanne, Monet, Gauguin, Van Gogh, and others. This educational experiment, supplemented with private tutors, was clearly a success. Additionally, an old upright piano unused in the family's parlor caught Ansel's interest. He gave it a serious try and taught himself to play in 3 months. His father added a piano teacher to the list of educational opportunities. Ansel had the natural talent of a prodigy and honed his gifts to brilliant peaks of performance. His parents certainly believed that as a concert pianist, Ansel would make them proud. There's someone in this room who has done the same thing. Doc Edwards, sitting in the back row, was trained as a classical pianist before deciding to choose art. Later in life, Ansel would say that the main effect of his study of piano was the discipline it engendered. Applying himself seriously to problems in music, he discovered the nature of perfection and learned that constant practice is necessary to master a craft. Exactitude can only be achieved through relentless repetition. 2 events in 1916, an introduction to photography and a family vacation to Yosemite, affected Ansel deeply and turned his future away from a career in music. He was given his first camera, a Kodak #1 box Brownie, which he took on the vacation that June. And how many people have had a Brownie box camera in their early life? Exactly. He was thrilled by the valley and recorded his reactions to the beauty that surrounded him. His early photographs showed an innate visual sensitivity. Thus, photography became his life force, and he returned to Yosemite every year of his life. Maturity in the discipline of the piano enabled Ansel to concentrate, and he returned to school, receiving his grammar school diploma in 1917. His formal education ended there. He continued to develop his primary interests, photography and music. He worked that summer at Frank Dittman's photo finishing business in San Francisco, endlessly processing customer snapshots produced en masse, a disturbing task to his artistic sensibilities. It was the artistic extreme of these snapshots and the mass production of them that offended him. He in the decades of the 1920s and 30s was a period of intense relationships involving the development of an intertwined philosophy of life, music, photography, and the environment. Beginning in 1919, he worked during the summers at Yosemite as the custodian of the Sierra Club's headquarters. He located a piano on which to continue practicing at Best Studio, a Yosemite concession that sold paintings, photographs, books, and souvenirs. There he also found Virginia Best, an enthusiastic student of vocal music. Love blossomed almost immediately, although marriage did not take place until 7 years later. Ansel began to make excursions into the high country of the Sierra Nevada surrounding Yosemite Valley, often with Frances Holman, an ornithologist who taught and encouraged him. Uncle Frank, as Ansel called him, knew the Sierra as well or better than any man alive, and Ansel learned the land and its animals from him. Ansel photographed the Sierra incessantly and began to publish articles and photographs in the Sierra Club Bulletin. He also became a leader of the annual group expeditions sponsored by the Sierra Club, which often included month-long journeys with professors and their wives from Stanford or Berkeley, with wonderful intellectual discussions around the campfires at night. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Sierra Club, you can read its mission. The Sierra Club was vital to Adams' early success as a photographer. His first published photographs and writings appeared in the club's 1922 bulletin, and he had his first one-man exhibition in 1928 at the club's San Francisco headquarters. Each summer, the club conducted a month-long high trip, usually in the Sierra Nevada, which attracted up to 200 members. The participants hiked each day to a new and beautiful campsite, accompanied by a large contingent of pack mules, packers, cooks, and the like. As photographer of these outings in the late 1920s, Ansel began to realize that he could earn enough to survive. Indeed, that he was far more likely to prosper as a photographer than as a concert pianist. He experimented with popular pictorial techniques of the day. The prevailing taste prescribed that a photograph should look like a charcoal drawing in order to have the cachet of art. He soon dropped these predilections and chose a more direct photographic style that presented the clarity of the mountains themselves. He searched for the age-old quest of the artist to develop a concept that was his alone. He determined that light itself was the most important ingredient in making a fine photograph. He found direct sunlight beaming at the subject was boring. For him, the light had to be special. It needed to reveal the subject in an important, definitive manner. He required that his prints be optically accurate, that they vividly depict and emotionally reflect his own response to the scene. He discovered that the most productive time to make photographs was early in the morning, late in the afternoon, or in the midst of inclement weather. He experimented with lenses of different shades, gauging their effect on the final print. He did not manipulate prints in the laboratory processing, choosing to keep his prints, have them reflect what the camera had actually taken. 1927 was a pivotal year for Adams, a young man of incredible energy whose passion for his work did not know the bounds of day or night. He would work until total exhaustion set in, then take to his bed for a few days to recover and begin the cycle all over again. He could also be very social, the life of the party, seeming to enjoy being the center of attention. Because of his prodigious skill at the piano, he became a favorite at parties given by the intellectual elite. At a party in Berkeley, he met Albert Bender, a supporter of the arts who became his patron, sponsoring his first portfolio, Parmelian Prints of the High Sierras. While making the final photographs for this portfolio, he decided he wanted to include a photo of Half Dome. He climbed to a location that he thought would give an unparalleled view of the Yosemite Valley's most spectacular spot. The massive granite block was in full shade when he arrived, so he waited for the light to be right. He had chosen a yellow plate for his lens, which he knew would make the sky come out a middle gray. He changed it for a red lens, which would create a darker density on the negative and therefore reflected his own emotional response to the scene. The photograph he made that day, Monolith, the Face of Half Dome, is optically accurate, but intensified in its tonal values. Ansel considered this photograph a breakthrough, his first intellectually determined photograph. The term he used was visualization, the ability to reason out before the exposure is made how the final print will look, controlling the end result by taking action before he snaps the image. This concept of visualization was one of Ansel's major contributions to photography, an understanding of the high order of technical command of the possibilities and materials of the medium. It was a synthesis of his values, that the inner response of the photographer dominates reality, that ideas dominate facts, and the print dominates the subject. The print is the expressive result of the artist's idea. Through careful and explicit arrangement, he could choose the best spatial relationship as well as the angle of view. He selected film for its particular spectral range and a filter for the best transmission of tones. He carefully considered the edges of the camera's viewing screen so as to eliminate anything extraneous from the image. For his books through the years, he also insisted on a level of reproduction that was considerably more exacting than what was thought possible at the time. Through his influential connections, including contacts who owned printing companies, he was able to ensure a quality of paper and processing techniques that assured a standard not seen before. The prints seemed more like originals than mass reproductions. Mass being 108 copies for his first volume. It had been his intention to delay marriage until he was fully able to support a family. He had proposed to Virginia Best, but then, with his career path not fully established, piano, photography, he had broken the engagement. Their relationship was uncertain when he went to visit her in Yosemite for New Year's Eve in 1928. He decided to propose again, even with an insecure future, and she accepted. They were married 3 days later. After 2 years of marriage, they built a house adjoining that of his parents, where the family garden had been. His darkroom remained in his parents' basement. Despite his heavy work schedule, Ansel and Virginia's house became a gathering for anyone interested in the arts. His dazzling skill at the piano also continued to make him a favorite of society hostesses, where the assembled guests might include Georgia O'Keeffe, John Marin, Robinson Jeffers, and others. In 1930, during a trip to Taos, he shared an artist's bungalow with photographer Paul Strand. Paul shared a group of his negatives with Ansel, which sparked profound common interest. He talked about his own commitment to photography as a fine art, about his friend, the well-known Alfred Stieglitz, about the artistic excitement brewing in New York City. This time, with a humanistic, intelligent, creative, and successful artist as a friend, Ansel sealed his decision to devote his creative life to photography. And he and Alfred Stieglitz did become friends as time went on. He opened his studio in his San Francisco home and plunged into a variety of photography-related activities. In 1931, he began to write photography reviews for a local magazine. In one, he praised the exhibit of photographer Edward Weston, whom he had met briefly at a social event earlier. Weston wrote him a note of thanks, and a firm friendship and exchange of creative ideas began. During these years, Ansel had continued his long-term involvement with the Sierra Club. In 1934, he was elected to its board of directors. He began to speak publicly about the nation's lack of concern for its land and resources. He proved to be such a compelling voice that the club sent him to Washington, D.C. 2 years later, where he lobbied Congress for the establishment of the Kings Canyon region of the Sierra Nevada as a national park. Throughout the rest of his life, he fought an unending series of battles, winning some, losing others, to preserve America for future generations. Ansel and Virginia had 2 children, Michael and Anne, born in the mid-1930s. With her father's death in 1936, Virginia inherited Best Studio, so she and Ansel moved their family to Yosemite. Ansel now had unlimited access to the park and to Curry Company, owner of the several concession stands there and his largest commercial client. He maintained his studio and business contacts in San Francisco, a 5-hour drive from the valley, causing a split family life until Ansel and Virginia moved to Carmel together much later, 1962. The 1940s were the most productive years of Ansel's career. His photographic style reached full development, and he made many of his classic images. He increased his teaching and published accounts of the technique he solidified, which he named the zone system. Developed in 1941, it divided the tonal scale into 11 zones or steps from black to white. Total black is the tone 0, middle gray is zone 5, white is zone 10. With this system, a photographer could assess the general contrast range of his subject and determine what specific areas related to specific zones of tone for the final print. He could then expose the film and develop it to standards that would provide the desired intensity for the visualized image. In the same breath that he spoke of the zone system, he would comment that there was nothing worse than a sharp picture of a fuzzy concept, and that the technique only had value as a means to strengthen the photographer's ability to express his visual ideas. In the late afternoon of October 31, 1941, he shot the photo called Moonrise. He could not have guessed that it would become the best-known image in the history of photography. Moonrise is spiritual, redemptory of man and earth. It is physically dominated by a black sky in an unusual use of space, but one essential to its spirit. The light on the crosses critical to the image disappeared as the sun set seconds after he made his exposure. Clearing Winter Storm is the most commercially successful of dozens of photographs that Ansel made from the same location over many years. He had tried for years to capture this view, but it eluded him until one winter day in 1944, just as a storm was ending, the sun brilliantly reappeared and the clouds took a form he had never seen before, enabling him to capture this special Earth event. Overlooking the Yosemite Valley, the spot was called the best general view by 19th century photographers. This inspirational view, somewhat changed by the addition of a road and a tunnel, continues to be photographed by millions of amateurs and professionals alike. Has anybody here been there and tried to take, there's one, that photograph? Ansel Adams' photography was not limited to expansive landscapes. Disturbed by the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II, he was pleased to be asked to document the internees living at the detention camp in Manzanar on the east slope of the Sierra Nevada. He took up the project enthusiastically and produced a group of photographs that show a magnificent people coping with a difficult situation. Published in 1944 as Born Free and Equal, the book is the artist's humanitarian statement about the effects of overreaction created by blind prejudice. The work includes some of his most powerful writing and, combined with the images, documents the dignity and pride retained by those interned at Manzanar. While nature was far and away his typical subject, he did photograph people, especially during the war, like this shot of trailer camp children in Redmond, California in 1944. The sheer number of prints that Ansel produced in a long life of compulsive photography overshadowed the significance and power of his writing. The excellence of his books on technique is well recognized, but his writing on the environment has been overshadowed. He was a respected leader and spokesperson, not only for photography as a fine art, but also for the need to preserve and care for the land. His first two Guggenheim Foundation fellowships in 1946 and 48 gave him the opportunity to spend substantial amounts of time photographing the national parks and monuments of America, and included his first visits to Hawaii and Alaska. These important photographs, while not as epic in their imagery, nonetheless have captured continuing attention. Here's one of the sandbar in the Rio Grande from Big Bend National Park. And this one called Dawn in Autumn at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee, 1948. Ansel continued an active career of teaching, writing books and articles, and photographing through the 1950s and 60s. He established the Ansel Adams Yosemite Workshop in 1955 to provide an intense short-term learning experience in creative photography. He educated and inspired thousands of hopeful photographers and encouraged them to develop their own personal vision and technical expertise. By 1980, Ansel was at the pinnacle of his influence. He was the subject of numerous articles. He and Virginia made a number of major financial donations that included the endowment of a permanent cultural fellowship at the Museum of Modern Art and a promised gift of their Carmel home and studio to the Friends of Photography. I have only touched lightly on his vast career and influence. Ansel's inspiration to photograph nature came from within himself. It was not just an attempt to memorialize the vistas of nature, but to put his personal vision of the importance of leaving land in its natural state, protected by the government. His photographs were routinely used on behalf of environmental concerns. Ansel Adams made photographs that are visual equivalents to American values. A great democratic country with wide, sweeping landscapes of grandeur and majesty. The subjects are enhanced by his visualization to portray landscapes beyond the limits of human experience. They are reverential ideals of nature and a pure, unspoiled America. The land in the West is expansive and optimistic. It promises a better life. In 1980, Ansel was presented with America's highest honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Jimmy Carter. It read, "At one with the power of the American landscape and renowned for the patience, skill, and timeless beauty of his work, photographer Ansel Adams has been visionary in his efforts to preserve this country's wild and scenic areas, both on film and on earth. Drawn to the beauty of nature's monuments, he is regarded by environmentalists as a monument himself and by photographers as a national institution. It is through his foresight and fortitude that so much of America has been saved for future Americans." The artist had become a national hero, a respected champion of art and nature. This status did not impact his ego, however, except to encourage him to continue the fight for environmental protection. On Easter Sunday, April 22nd, 1984, his heart failed and death came peacefully. To end this presentation, here are just a few more prints that I couldn't resist including. There you have it.